Therapists differ in their ability to effect change. We may not like to think it, but it is so. How many times have we heard someone referred to as a gifted therapist? Is this some inborn talent, like musical talent or artistic talent or athletic ability? And if so, are the rest of us ungifted folks doomed to mediocre performance? Not so, says Dr. Scott Miller, our first speaker and co-founder of the Center for Clinical Excellence. Citing research going back to 1974, Miller tells us that the evidence is incontrovertible. Who provides the therapy is a much more important determinant of success than what treatment method is provided. And the key to superior performance, simple as it may seem, involves constantly working harder, evaluating, and improving one's performance. To do that, we first have to know our baseline performance and then engage in more deliberate practice to improve our work. This willingness to engage in deliberate practice is what makes some therapists supershrinks, and the rest, well, simply average. What's really scary is that we might not know which we are because, in the words of Sherlock Holmes, mediocrity knows nothing higher than itself. But we'll let Dr. Miller tell you about it. Scott D. Miller, Ph.D., is a co-founder of the Center for Clinical Excellence, an international group of clinicians, researchers, and educators dedicated to promoting excellence in behavioral health. Dr. Miller conducts workshops and training in the United States and abroad, helping hundreds of agencies and organizations, both public and private, to achieve superior results. He is one of a handful of invited faculty whose work, thinking, and research is featured at the prestigious Evolution of Psychotherapy conference. His humorous and engaging presentation style and command of the research literature consistently inspires practitioners, administrators, and policymakers to make effective changes in service delivery. Dr. Miller is the author of numerous articles and books, among which are Psychotherapy with Impossible Cases, Efficient Treatment of Therapy Veterans with Barry Duncan and Mark Hubble, The Heart and Soul of Change with Mark Hubble, Barry Duncan, and Bruce Wampold, The Heroic Client, A Revolutionary Way to Improve Effectiveness Through Client-Directed, Outcome-Informed Therapy with Barry Duncan and Jacqueline Sparks, and the forthcoming Achieving Clinical Excellence, Lessons from the Field's Most Effective Practitioners. Dr. Miller, you say that who provides the therapy is more important than what treatment is used. And I wanted to go into that, if that's really true.
Well, I think the evidence is actually fairly convincing that the provider of services has a greater impact on the outcome than the particular treatment model employed when it comes to the provision of psychological services or behavioral health care services. I'm certainly not against evidence. The question is what evidence we use to guide the services that we offer. And right now there is a very particular, and I would even call peculiar, view of what constitutes evidence. Somewhere back in the 80s, our field decided it was going to ape medicine, and medicine in what is now recognized as a fairly limited model decided that the randomized clinical trial where you pit alternate treatments against one another, or even more often, you simply pit a treatment against no treatment at all, or a sham treatment, was the best research design we could use to decide what would be the best treatment approaches. So our field took that up, and we've been running randomized clinical trials and claiming that certain models are more effective than others, when in fact the evidence doesn't say this. We've run very cutting-edge, scientifically sound meta-analytic studies comparing treatments for a variety of conditions in children and adults, from depression to post-traumatic stress disorder to alcohol abuse and dependence, and we find no difference in outcome between treatment approaches that are intended to be helpful. You find a dramatic difference, of course, when you compare a treatment approach against no treatment, and some difference when you compare it against a sham treatment. This leaves open the question then, well, if there's no difference between treatment approaches, then what treatment approach do you use? And if I'm talking to consumers, what I say is choose your provider carefully, because the amount of variability in outcomes directly attributable to the provider of services is 8 to 9 times greater than the variability attributable to the particular approach that provider happens to use. And so, yes, it's absolutely true.
That's amazing, because when you think of all the time that's spent in conferences, seminars, workshops, talking about this treatment method or that treatment method, it's very wonderful to hear something different, that it doesn't matter whether you make an interpretation here or there. It's more like who's doing it.
Yes, I think that's part of it. More specifically, it doesn't matter so much if you apply a particular approach for a given diagnostic condition. It may matter a great deal to an individual client, but in general, when we compare treatments for very specific diagnoses, we don't see any difference at all. And it really comes down to the abilities of that individual therapist to connect with the client. And I think this is the very good news. When you look at the factors that do predict outcome, the particular treatment approach predicts very little, if any. Neither really does the diagnosis that a client gets predict the outcome, but rather who's providing that particular service and the kind of engagement that they're able to gain while working with that particular client, or what's often referred to as the alliance. That relationship and that particular therapist's ability to relate to, and as I said, engage that client in alternate kinds of behavior, and alternate thinking, and alternate ways of dealing with and handling their emotions.
What makes one therapist better than another? What makes one person be the best rather than mediocre?
That's the million-dollar question, and if that were the question our field were debating, I would be a happy camper. Unfortunately, very little research has been done for reasons that you could probably imagine if you let your thoughts run wild for a minute. The first study about this was done back in 1974 by a person named David F. Ricks, who was looking at adults who had been treated while adolescents in a state healthcare system. I believe it was in the state of New York, but don't hold me to that. His article is interesting and fascinating reading, and virtually no one has even heard of David F. Ricks. It was in a book called The History of Research in Psychopathology. And in essence, what he did, again, was he looked at these adults who'd been treated as kids, and he found that some of them were living very productive lives. They had gone on with jobs and relationships, careers, kids and families, and stayed out of the legal and the mental health care system. Other kids had struggled their entire life, ended up in prison settings or in mental health settings, and never seemed to thrive. He wanted to look at what accounted for the difference, and he was very careful in this initial research to make sure that he was comparing apples to apples. He was looking at kids that were matched for their family background, their history, the severity of their problems, etc., and he found that none of those things really mattered that much. What mattered mostly was who treated the particular kid. And some of the kids had been treated by a particular therapist in his study who had far superior outcomes than other therapists in the study. He called that person a supershrink. That's his language, not mine. And he called the other therapist in the sample who had very poor outcomes a pseudo-shrink. It was just a preliminary investigation, and we're now just beginning to turn our attention and our sights to what leads some clinicians to be more effective than others. Of course, the first step in the process is to find out who's effective. And we can't wait, like David F. Ricks did, for 25 years and measure these young children as adults, because it's going to take too long. So what we've done as a group has been promoting the use of outcome measures. Clinicians pick up a scale, their clients fill that out, and they aggregate the data, and they can get an idea about just how effective they are. Again, this is very new, done within the last 10 years that people are being encouraged to measure their outcomes. And that's the first step. If you want to be a better golfer, or if you want to find out who the best golfer is, you should find out their score, for example. And so we've done that, and we've identified people who consistently score in the top quartile of outcomes with regard to their peer group or in their geographic location or just in the world. And we're trying to understand what is it that these people do that's different.
Any preliminary understandings? The article that was in the Psychotherapy Networker a year or so ago was stupendous in describing this.
Well, there are a couple of findings that and I would say that this is very much, Barbara, the sort of wet edge of the paint for us. We're learning. What I'm saying now shouldn't be cast in stone. It's an exciting area of research simply because it's completely open. It's the Wild West. One of the key things that these therapists do that is different from average therapists, and that's who we're comparing it to. We're comparing it to the best to the rest, not the best to the worst here. And these therapists in general seek, obtain, and maintain more consumer engagement than the average clinician does. And you may ask, well, how do they do that? How do they seek, maintain, and obtain more consumer engagement? We've noticed a very interesting pattern by using measures in following and tracking the outcomes of therapists. And one of the interesting patterns we've noticed is that the superior performing therapists often score lower in the beginning stages of providing a service to their clients as compared to average therapists on measures of the Therapeutic Alliance.
I don't understand. How could that
Well,
be?
Yeah, that's what it puzzles most people, because most people, of course, would associate better outcomes with higher scores on the measure that we use as the session rating scale. It's a very simple alliance tool. In essence, what it does is it gives a snapshot of the engagement level and activity, that bond between the client and their therapist. And these superior performing therapists tend, on balance, to get lower scores in the beginning than their more average peers. Average peers tend to get higher scores in the beginning. And when we've looked more carefully at this, we've noticed that the Supershrinks not only get lower scores in the beginning, but those scores tend to improve over time, where average therapists' scores tend to either start high and stay high, or start high and decrease over time. What could account for this? What we've come up with is that these therapists, in the work that they do with their clients, somehow manage to get more negative feedback about what they're providing to their client early in the treatment process.
By negative feedback, what do you mean?
I mean that the therapist creates a culture, an environment in the session where the clients can say, we're not doing what I'd hoped to do here. You haven't understood me in a way that I believe I am, and the methods that we're using don't seem to fit me exactly. And they do this because they feel able to. They don't feel like there's going to be criticism, that the therapist will take umbrage at this or punish them. And so it's truly a collaborative partnership between the two. The therapist tries something, the client feels willing and able to say it needs to be tweaked in this way. The therapist doesn't take that as a sign of the client's pathology, but instead takes that as a generous clue about how to work more productively together. And it creates a virtuous rather than a vicious cycle. These therapists are simply more inviting of that kind of negative feedback. And they then adjust the services, which lead to improvements. The average therapist, and again, remember, we're comparing them to their peers, and their more average peers in terms of outcome, tend to take, and I'll say this twice, they tend to take an absence of negative feedback as an endorsement of the status quo. Let me say it again. They tend to take the absence of negative feedback as an endorsement of the status quo. In other words, things must be okay because the client isn't complaining. And therefore, they don't work very hard at getting that kind of information from their client that they could then use to improve the engagement levels of that particular client.
Well, you would think then if the client keeps paying and keeps returning, that would lead the therapist to say, okay, this is going all right.
Yeah, you would think that. Unfortunately, and now you're pointing really at the second largest finding that we have, and that is the superior therapists are much more sensitive to the risk of dropout and deterioration or lack of change in the early phases of treatment. We think if the client's going to continue to come back, that must mean something. But the truth is a very large percentage of people don't come back after the first and second and third visits. They drop out. And we have protected ourselves in some way, and you can hear, I think, support here in what I was just arguing, by saying that these particular clients didn't come back because, A, they got what they wanted, or B, because they were too ill to appreciate what I was offering. In either case, the therapist remains insulated and protected against this potentially negative feedback. Now, I'm not suggesting that what the client is saying is correct or accurate. because I have no idea of a way of judging that. What I am saying is that the therapists are able to solicit more of this information, and their attention to it creates stronger bonds, which result in better outcomes overall.
Well, I could be flip. This is a little bit flip, but maybe the average therapist who gets the higher ratings at the start should just do very, very brief treatment, and then let the other people who are more able to let things develop and encourage things to develop might be better at the longer-term treatment. Is that at all valid?
I think in general what happens in our field is that a significant percentage, estimates range up to 47%. Up to 47% of people in some studies drop out without experiencing a reliable improvement in their functioning, and they don't tell their therapist, which sort of is even more troubling, because then the therapist is prevented from getting the feedback. But the second and I think more troubling finding is that a very small percentage of people, both in psychological services and in healthcare in general, account for the lion's share of the expenses. So you can have people who continue to come to therapy week after week after week, and estimates are between 10 and 20% of those people who start treatment end up accounting for 60 to 70% of the expenses by the end of it. So you've got people who go for a long period of time and who don't get well. You've got people who go for a short period of time and don't get well. Now, let me just say, in defense of therapists and therapy, average therapist outcomes are very good. But we're not here to talk about average therapists. We're talking about the superior therapists. When you look at the average outcomes of psychological services in the U.S., dating back now 30 years, you go back all the way 30 years, the outcomes have remained largely the same. The outcomes of psychological treatments are on par with coronary artery bypass surgery and treatments known for acute stroke and myocardial infarction. So our outcomes are really quite good. But that said, that's the given. That's where we're starting. The question really is why does that physician doing a coronary artery bypass graft do so much better than average? And we're saying the same thing about psychotherapists here. Some of them do slightly better. And it's in those small differences where we achieve gold records, or gold medals, so to speak. So what is it that those people are doing? They're more attentive to that 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 clients who is not making progress. How do they do it? We can go into that in a minute. And they are much more sensitive to dropout. They don't say this to themselves, that it's okay that clients drop out. They don't defend themselves. In fact, in a very non-scientific finding that we published in the Supershrink article, we found at 2 locations that the superior performing therapists also had the highest outgoing call logs of the therapists in the entire clinic, meaning that these therapists didn't settle after a first, second, and third visit. They would sometimes pick up the phone, or at least significantly more often than their average peers, and call the client. Again, this isn't scientific, but we talked to some of these people and asked them, why are you calling? And the general gist of feedback we got from these superior performing therapists was, I was dying to know. I was dying to know. Did what I say help? Did it make a difference? Was I right about my diagnosis? Was this homework I gave engaging and interesting? So it wasn't about checking in on the client in sort of some dependent fashion, but rather about refining their skills. And that feedback loop is really a huge part of what separates the good from the great.
Well, I want to talk about how the feedback enhances the therapeutic relationship. And what kind of feedback are we talking about?
We don't really understand or know how the Supershrinks do this naturally. We're in a bit of an empirical bind, as you may well imagine. There have always been, and people do believe that there are superior therapists. The only way we could find them, since most methods for identifying them, like peer nomination, are unreliable, what we did is we asked all therapists in various agencies around the world to fill out outcome tools. And then we've looked at therapists, again, as I said at the beginning, who've consistently scored very high in terms of their outcomes. And so that's how we've been measuring the outcomes. And with regard to the feedback piece, we've watched how these therapists deal differently when they get information about their work. Now, how the individual therapists do this before we measure them, we don't know. But we do know that the superior performing therapists, for example, get lower SRS scores, which has led us to assume, once again, and consistent with other research on expertise, that these people won't settle. They're interested in knowing, and they create an environment where people feel free to complain. And I mean complain in the most non-pejorative, whiny way. I mean it simply that they say that it wasn't up to what I had hoped for, which allows for process improvement.
SRS score is what, please?
The session rating scale is our SRS score. It's a very brief alliance tool, and if you go to my personal website, that's scottdmiller.com, Scott D as in David Miller.com, go down to the tab that says Performance Metrics. Individual clinicians can download and use those scales for free. We have two. One is the outcome rating scale, which is a very brief way of measuring your outcomes. You can take that data, you can aggregate it, and determine your effectiveness. And then the SRS is, again, that alliance measure. It tells us about the bond, the engagement level with the client.
What about the idea of the match or the fit between the therapist and the patient and their attachment styles and how everything blends together? Does this matter to the Supershrink?
It matters to some and not to others. I haven't met any, except unless they're perhaps of a dynamic leaning that would potentially bring that up. But what these therapists do is that they are dynamic in interaction with the client. They are seeking and obtaining feedback. That feedback allows them to alter their style to better accommodate whatever it is the client's presenting with. The funny thing about the way we do research in our field is we hold variables constant, and then we try to treat. So if you give a dose of antibiotics, well, then you give the same dose. Everybody doesn't get their own dose, even though they may need a very specific dose. And the superior therapists use very careful observation, interaction, and engagement with the client to alter the dose, type, level, and intensity of services they offer.
So let's go to an example of the feedback. I mean, I know that there's no standard rubber stamp kind of feedback questions to ask, but in the article you gave the example of Dawn and how she responded to the older person who...
Yes, it was an elderly gentleman whose wife had passed away, and she just had a sense that she hadn't engaged him completely. It's in the session, and when you watch this kind of thing happen as a clinician, and the client then confirms, and all of us have had that experience where we say to the client something that nobody else would have potentially said, and the client is shocked and they're helped because of it, or they agree. But these superior therapists do it better and more often. So the question is how to help average therapists be able to emulate the behavior of Supershrinks. Because Supershrinks, as I said, none of them before we did the project were using our measurement tools. So here's what I usually say. Where birds can fly, the rest of us need an airplane. Me and the rest of the average therapists in the world, we can listen to people who extol the virtues of listening carefully and reflecting feelings and attending to and trying to create a culture of feedback. You can hear all that kind of stuff. The problem is we don't have the scaffolding and the structure to make that happen. So, in other words, we need an airplane. The Supershrinks do it in diverse ways. There are a million different species of birds, and they all fly in slightly different ways. Their bone structure is slightly different. But we can copy that structure. And one thing therapists could do right now, average therapists, if they wanted to improve their outcomes, was to begin to measure the outcomes on a regular basis at every single session. Now, let me just say, if a therapist listening to this rolls their eyes and thinks, oh, my God, I'm not going to do that, well, there's good news and bad news. Either they're a super shrink already, or they're average and they're not likely to improve. So if you want to improve your outcomes, there's a very simple way to do it. Measure the outcomes and then talk about them with the client at every single visit. You would expect the same dialogue with your physician if you were trying to get your blood pressure or blood sugar levels, blood glucose levels in balance. You'd want them to measure every single time. And if they weren't coming into balance in spite of the physician's treatments, you would want either a different kind of service or a different physician at some point. And it's the same thing here. Measure and monitor your outcomes, and then at the end of each visit, measure and monitor the status of the alliance and discuss it with your client.
So you would say what, for example?
In the beginning, I would say the following. I'd say, I work a little differently than you may be accustomed to. And I know from the research literature that if I'm going to be of help and service to you, you should start to see signs of improvement sooner rather than later, generally within 5 or 6 weeks. That may not mean that you're finished or done, but you should not have to wait months and months before you experience an effect of our work together. If you're not experiencing some kind of benefit, then you and I need to talk about what I can do differently, where else you can go, and ultimately, if I don't help you, I will help you get in touch with someone else that may be able to be of more help. And the way we'll notice this is I'm going to ask you to fill out this simple scale, and you and I will talk about it every single time. At the end of my visit, I'm doing a similar repeat. I say, again, here's the last piece, and I like to hand out this brief tool, and it's like taking the temperature of our work together. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Is it just right? And I then add, high scores mean very little to me here. I'm not going to take what you say personally. I will take it seriously. And what I want to know is how can I improve the service that I'm providing to you and secretly to everybody else who sits in your chair from hour to hour here. So really go through here. It doesn't have to be something egregious, large. It can be something that may, even in your mind, seem inconsequential as you fill out this measure about what's happened over the last hour. And then I hand out the form.
Dr. Miller, let's say that you're in a session with someone who's been talking about some very upsetting material. They're crying, they're very emotional, or another example, perhaps the person is very angry, or it's a couple and they're very upset and emotional, or it's a person with a borderline personality disorder. And it's not going to be easy to end the session, either for the person or for you. So then how do you give that person outcome questions to answer? It would seem to me that it would be sort of out of nowhere or not empathic.
Well, let's take a look. The first thing is we talked about that you're going to start the conversation you have with clients by reintroducing at each visit and trying to create a culture of feedback. That culture of feedback states that I work a little differently, that I'm interested in hearing how you're doing between sessions and how you experience this particular visit. And so at the end of each visit, each time that we meet, I'm going to be asking you for feedback because I don't know if the session was too hot, too cold, or just right. That involves filling out a very brief survey, takes usually about a minute, and then I look at it and see if we should talk about it. A lot of these kinds of questions can be dealt with by ensuring that you've created the culture of feedback in the beginning. That's the first answer. The second answer is the clients are very upset, and it's going to be hard to end the session anyway. I think the use of the SRS, the session rating scale, or any alliance tool that you want to use, that's the perfect time to do it. When actually you may end up with some feedback that says to you that the way you did the session today that led to whatever emotions are being experienced was too much, or in fact, if it's just right. If you're concerned about that, then, and people express concerns about this both at the beginning and the end of the visit, frankly, Barbara, and what they'll say, sometimes I'll have a client come in a crisis and they're so upset, and then I'm supposed to hand them this form to fill out. That seems kind of rude. And I always use an example, a television show, and this will show you just how kitschy I am, from the 1980s that was called Rescue 911 with the William Shatner. And, whether you like the show or not, what was always impressive to me about these 911 operators, and you think about that, there's probably no more stressful job than fielding phone calls from people who are in an automobile accident, whose child is just drowned, who've cut off their arm with a bandsaw out in their yard, and here's this 911 operator. Now, what does that 911 operator do? They don't say, well, let's not talk about it. In fact, they get an incredible amount of detailed information from people who, at the moment of crisis, their name, their age, the description of the situation, their address. My sense is that if therapists are committed to getting feedback, that this will be exactly the time that you either A, want to measure the client's baseline, or B, get feedback about what they've just experienced the last hour.
Do you think it's okay to let patients leave their sessions angry or upset? Or do they always have to feel kind of resolved in some way?
Do I think it's okay? I think it's going to happen, and that we need to be able to deal with that eventuality. Clients will be upset, and giving the ORS gives me a critical opportunity to discuss that and to perhaps ensure that the client doesn't take whatever they felt during the session, and because I didn't address it, not come back an additional time. Dropout, remember, following the first visit, is the single largest threat to outcome that we know about. Studies indicate nearly half of the people who start treatment in the United States drop out after a single visit. And it's high at the second. So that's the key. I want to be able to ask for feedback and make sure. Now, what happens if the client gives me low marks? Well, we kind of talked about this, but in essence, says that either I didn't understand, etc. I usually do one of two or three things. I usually say, well, if I'm right up against the end of the hour and the client doesn't seem too upset about this, but they do say, yes, I didn't feel like you heard, or we didn't really talk about what I wanted to talk about, or your approach, I'm not sure about a good fit, I say one of two things. Number one, would it be okay if we talk about this at the beginning of your very next session? Because this is exactly what I should have been on top of, and I'm sorry we missed it. If I get any hesitation at all, and I've got somebody else in the waiting room, I say, would it be okay if I called you at the end of the day and followed up and heard more about what you had to say? You would expect this in a restaurant, in a hotel. Why wouldn't you expect this from the person treating you, a mental health professional? If the client is not too upset, and they say, yes, that'd be okay and we can take this up at the beginning of the next visit, and then I always ask at the end then, is there anything in what we've talked about today that would prevent you from attending this appointment, the next appointment? If they say no, I say, if something comes up, will you call me and let me know? All I'm doing is trying to use that measure as a shoehorn to slip that client back into the seat to give me one more chance to engage them.
That's very helpful. Very helpful.
Thanks. My sense is that therapists' reticence about using the scales has more to do with their lack of familiarity with it, and all of us need some sort of hooks to hang, some language hooks to sort of be able to approach clients when these situations come up. But I've been watching therapists do this now for close to 9 years, and I'm amazed at how therapists can ask for feedback, especially at those particular times where they seem most needed.
You're right about language hooks, especially for a new skill or introducing a new procedure. You really do need to have some language hooks. That's a great way of putting it. What if the person you're seeing has a big need to please you or to not show anger and not be critical? And what if simultaneously you as a therapist want to be seen as very helpful and very good? So you don't want to hear anything much negative. So you got a person who can't express anything too negative and the person who can't listen to anything too negative. So then where are you?
There's a couple of things. Let's start with the latter instance first, start talking about the therapist. The best way to get better outcomes is, in fact, to be open to negative feedback. So the best way to ensure mediocrity and average outcomes is to get no feedback about your performance, which is exactly what the research literature says happens to most therapists. Their outcomes improve for about 6 to 8 weeks of starting, and then they level off and they don't get any better. At the same time, confidence levels go up. Think about that. You have therapists feeling more and more confident despite the fact that their outcomes are remaining relatively average. So the first thing you can do if you want to improve is to get some feedback about areas where you could change something. Now, let's go back to the first example with regard to the client who has a need to. Now, I'm always puzzled by this comment, although I hear it fairly often. First off, who gets to decide whether the client is that way or not? That is, shy or prone not to disclose. Who gets to decide that? Well, usually the therapist who's sitting opposite that client who may have engendered that very behavior. And this idea is supported by our research, which shows that variability in the alliance and feedback is not attributable to the client. It's attributable to the therapist. In other words, some therapists create a culture in which clients, regardless of how they present, are more likely to disclose. Other therapists, more average therapists, create an environment in which clients are less likely. So I would say the fickle finger of responsibility points back at us. Now, that can create monumental amounts of frustration, because the truth is, most of us average clinicians, me included, have no idea about how to language things, the scaffolding and the structure, in order to get that kind of negative feedback. In fact, we do things and we scaffold and we talk and we create an environment in which it's virtually guaranteed that the client won't. So let me give you an example. I've already said that the superior performing therapists are much more likely to have contact with their clients between visits. Whenever I make this statement at a workshop, somebody invariably raises their hand and say, won't that create dependency? And another one raises their hand and says, what about boundary issues? We are well defended against this idea when all I'm recommending is when you give an assignment, maybe you should follow up and find out between visits, these people, the superior performing clinicians, and in fact physicians, radiologists, chess players, pianists, they share the same quality. They are dying to know. Did it work?
Years back, I saw a patient who said to me that I was a B-plus therapist. She said, you're a B-plus, but I want an A-plus. And I asked her what would make me be an A-plus, and she really didn't know.
Yeah.
She really couldn't say, but she kept coming back, and she kept complaining about me. I just couldn't get at what she wanted me to be.
Yeah.
What she wanted me to be doing differently. So I tried. Maybe I didn't try hard enough, or I didn't pursue.
Well, there's two things, and this kind of points into the last and the third item that is on our list of things that the superior performing therapists do. So the person says you're a B-plus therapist, and what they've given you is really no useful information, as you're pointing out, about how you can change your behavior. We find that, for the most part, clients are often unable to give you specific, direct instructions for how to change the treatment in order to improve their experience of it. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is you could use this alliance tool I'm telling you about, because it's going to give you 4 very specific pieces of feedback at the end of each visit, just like that. So you can go in and you'll be able to see where the client is saying that things are not just right. That's the first step. The second step relates to the third point and difference that we've noticed about superior performing clinicians, and that is they're constantly pushing their realm of reliable performance. The problem in our field and in every field where average is, in fact, the average, is that people's outcomes level off at an average level and they stop getting feedback, and in fact, they begin to explain and understand their average outcomes. At the same time, their confidence level increases. What happens to make that happen, researchers call automaticity. We stop thinking about our work. We say things like, I've seen this before. Now, automaticity isn't bad in and of itself. You have to have automaticity in order to walk. Otherwise, you'd never get up from a crawling position. Some things have to become automatic. At the same time, most of us are no better at walking than we were when we were 3, because we're not thinking about it anymore. And the way to think about it is to engage in a process called deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is not a concept I invented. It really owes its entire existence to a phenomenal psychologist and researcher by the name of K. Anders Ericsson. And K. Anders Ericsson is the one whose research has really opened my eyes, at least, in terms of understanding the difference between average and superior, by noting that these people engage in deliberate efforts to improve target performance. So here's the key first. You have to know that your performance is either average or less than average. That can help you engage and develop a plan of deliberate practice for improving those outcomes. Then you have to set some very specific target behaviors that you want to change, and you have to develop a very detailed plan about how you're going to approach that. In your example, your client says you're a B-plus therapist. What I would be doing after the session, what superior performers do, is videotape or audio tape that session, sit down and think about what's going on in the session that may be contributing to a okay performance. Not a great, not perfect, but okay. You then develop a plan with very specific targets in terms of process, what you're going to say and what you're going to do. Because the truth is, most of us do this on the fly, or when we're not doing it on the fly, it's become automatic. This means you're deliberately sitting down, having out a step-by-step plan, and in your step-by-step plan, you don't just have one direction, you consider permutations. So you might say to a client who says you did really good today, you might say something like, I'm very happy to hear that. What would have made it better? If the client says nothing could have made it better, you would need to consider 2 or 3 alternate ways to ask that same question to get information. You'd have a very deliberate plan. You then go back the next time and you try out your plan. At the end of that visit, you look back at, did your plan work to achieve the target process objectives? Did you miss any steps in the plan? If it didn't work, you're thinking again. This seems to be what leads to superior performance, say, in chess. In contrast to popular myth, chess players do not have superior memories. They don't have a superior IQ. What they have are more lateral moves at every point along the chessboard. Unlike me, I have like 2 or 3 ways I play chess. For them, each move on the chessboard, there are multiple permutations from that particular point. They've gotten this by rehearsing and practicing those steps one by one before and after they play. That's the process of deliberate practice. And it is very intense, and it is why most people settle for average.
There's a lot in the theory that kind of makes it, well, in the psychodynamic theory, that makes that not so easy to do because of the multi-layered aspects of it, perhaps, but also because, for instance, Winnicott, developmental child psychiatrist, had the concept of the good enough mother. And so you think, well, I've done a good enough job with this person. It's a good enough job. It's not the greatest, it's not the best, but it's good enough. And so you don't grow then. Yeah? No?
Right. And you know what? Good is good. We're talking about average versus superior. The question is whether or not you want to be a superior performer or not. And you know what's amazing about this, and this isn't my idea, this is an author whose work I also admire. His name's Jeff Colvin. He's written a phenomenal book called Talent is Overrated. He says, think about the people around you and the work that they do. And most of us, and this includes me, most of us go to work every day and we work at the same thing every day, and we're good at what we do. But isn't it interesting how few of us are actually great at what we do? And why is that? He asks, why is it? And he says there are 2 primary reasons. Number 1, people believe that greatness is due to an innate inborn talent, for which Erickson says there is absolutely no proof. And secondly, he says, even if there is such a thing as native inborn genetic talent, it doesn't seem to matter because, for example, there are chess grandmasters who have below average IQs. So I agree with you. For most of us, it's okay to be good, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to improve your performance, there are some very specific steps you can take, but it is hard work.
Well, the hard work would reflect in an improvement in the relationship, wouldn't it? Because the patient or the client would see that, gee, this person is really trying hard, it really wants me to be better, really wants me to grow, or this person really wants to help me.
I'm not sure the clients are going to notice that.
Really?
I don't know. No primary research has been done on the subject, but I wish instead therapists had that idea, that I really want to grow, I really want to get better. But what happens typically is our confidence grows and our outcomes remain flat. And I mean flat, I mean average. the best physics instructors and professors and thinkers, they may experience a decline in virtually every other aspect of their functioning, but they don't experience it in the realm in which they deliberately practice. And so for me, it's very good news. You can not only maintain your skill level, but you can improve your skills and your outcomes virtually until your death. But it does require effort. I think it's important to note that, again, we're just learning about this and bringing these ideas to the field of therapy. They've been in operation in sports and in music and other areas, business, for a long time, but they're just now coming to the field of therapy. So I think it's critical, number one, that you've given exposure to them in general. And I hope that when I present the ideas, that my commentary about where the field is at and where we need to go isn't discouraging, but instead gives, as you say, which I think is the best feedback you could give me, some very specific, concrete steps people can take in order to improve their performance. Otherwise, we just feel like it's all futile, and it is definitely not futile. Download and use the scales. Talk about them with your client. Begin to record some of your sessions that you feel like you're struggling with. Develop a plan of deliberate practice and get a coach whose work you admire to learn a very specific skill and have them listen and comment about your plan. These are all things you can do to improve your performance, and they will pay off in terms of outcome.
Dr. Miller, thank you. I want to say again that your article in Psychotherapy Networker is a feast, and it should be read by every therapist. I really, because people don't realize how, what's the word for it, sanguine they get about how they're doing, how complacent, and it's so important. I love the article, and I'm very happy that you gave us the time today to speak with you.
My pleasure. You can download that article and all the scales and everything else from my website again at scottdmiller.com. There is a link there. It says scholarly publications and handouts, and you can download it there. And Barbara, I respond to all of my email. Sometimes it takes me a day or two, but everybody gets a response. And if you don't get a response within 3 days, it means I haven't gotten your email. So you should send it again. And I love the subject, and I love talking to clinicians. I'm very hopeful about us as a group. We're resourceful. And I think once the information is available, we'll suck it up.
Okay, Dr. Miller, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
This concludes our interview with Dr. Scott Miller. We hope you learned from this interview and that you enjoyed it. To order Dr. Miller's publications, view his workshop calendar, download his evaluation forms, and to contact him, visit his website, www.scottdmiller.com. I need to say here that the views expressed by our speakers are theirs alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of On Good Authority. On behalf of On Good Authority, this is Barbara Alexander. Thank you for listening.